Hello, my friends. Well, as promised, Mike and I are putting together a series of short devotionals centered around the events of Holy Week. And the purpose of these devotionals is really the same as the whole season of Lent, to really kind of shape our posture, put us in the right kind of frame of mind so that when we get to Good Friday, we get to Easter, we truly know how much we need the cross and the empty tomb. Yesterday we celebrated Palm Sunday, and there was a parade, at least a virtual one. There was a parade and celebration, and it was the culmination in many ways of Jesus' proclamation of who he is, that he is the King, that he is the Messiah, that he is the one who comes to save us from our sins. And so if Palm Sunday in many ways is the culmination of Jesus telling us who he is, the events of Holy Week tell us in a lot of ways what he has come to do. So on Monday, we know that he leaves Bethany, a place for him that has been a place of refuge, a place of rest. And he heads out with his disciples and he goes to Jerusalem, particularly to the temple. And there he confronts many of the temple systems and the religious leaders. I want to read from Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 19. We know it says that that the next day, meaning after Sunday, they left Bethany. And it says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. And when I was a kid, I remember going to the beach. And when you're at the beach, you spend time splashing around in the water and making sand castles and burying one another. But I also remember something else. I remember finding sticks and writing things in the sand, where the water comes up. And in fact, before you're able to write something, you have to take a bucket of water and clear a space in order to write something, whatever it is, your name, some message, or you have to wait for the waves to come up. In fact, if you want to redo altogether what you have written, you just wait for the waves to come up and clear the whole area again, to make it new, to renew this area on which you want to write. Which reminds me of the verses from Ezekiel, where God speaks through Ezekiel, telling his people who he is going to now bring out of exile, that he's going to do something new in them. Now, he has sent them into exile because of their disobedience. He was going to be their God, and they were going to be his people, but they haven't kept their end of the bargain. They were an idolatrous group. They counted on God being for them, but they weren't obedient. So God gave them over to their sinfulness and allowed them to be taken into Babylon. But now he is going to do something new. He was going to call them back. And he says through the prophet Ezekiel these words. And this is what reminded me of the writing of new things on the beach. In Ezekiel chapter 36, he says, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and will give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Now, obviously, he's talking about bringing them back from exile and doing a new thing in them. And as I read this story from Mark about Jesus coming into the temple, I wonder if Jesus isn't doing a similar thing in clearing of the temple court. Now, this whole episode, this action that goes on here, happens in the outer court where the Gentiles were allowed to be. They weren't allowed to go any further than that. In fact, there were barriers and signs all over the place. It said that Gentiles weren't allowed to go beyond there. They weren't allowed to go into the holy place, or the most holy place, of course, where only the high priest could go. But in this area, in this Gentile court, this is where a marketplace had been set up, where pilgrims who came to the temple to offer sacrifice or to pay a temple tax could take their Roman money, their Roman currency, and turn it into Hebrew currency, which was required by Jewish law. That's how they paid the temple tax. Or that's where they bought sacrifices to make atonement for sin. And they needed to, the sacrifices had to be without blemish. And while they may have had in their own homes doves or goats or lambs or whatever it might be that were without blemish, they couldn't risk bringing those animals with them in the long journey, risking that they might become blemished, because then they couldn't be used in the temple sacrifice. So they, in this marketplace, would buy those animals that they would use for sacrifice. Well, Jesus interrupts all of this by driving out the buyers and the sellers and turning over the tables and the benches. But what Jesus does here is not just about the unjust practices. It's not just about the consumerism there in the temple, although it is partially about that, to be sure. It's not just about that, or it's not just about creating a space for the Gentiles to worship the Lord in. In order to understand kind of why Jesus is doing that, you have to look at what Jesus says. And you have to look at where he gets his words. He's actually quoting from the prophet Isaiah here. And in fact, he quotes from Isaiah chapter 56. Now, in chapter 56 of Isaiah, God is speaking this incredible word of inclusion for Gentiles, inclusion for eunuchs, for the foreigners, that he is going to have all of them be part of his promise for all people. He says this through Isaiah. Let no foreigners who have bound themselves to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. For this is what the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath and are obedient to me, I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. Can you imagine? Better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. This is people who have formerly been excluded by the law. And to foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord and minister them, all who keep the Sabbath and are obedient, he says, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. And that's when he goes on to say words that eventually Jesus uses, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. For all nations. And this is what Jesus quotes after he turns over the tables. See, the temple had become a place of exclusion, not one of inclusion. Non-Jews were only allowed in this place. They were allowed no further. Even women weren't allowed in there either. The temple essentially preserved the status quo and extended privileges to a very few. Salvation was for Jews only, and only pure, obedient Jews at that. And leaders wanted it that way. They wanted it to stay that way. But Jesus was saying that this was to be a place for all people, for all nations. God's house was to accept all people, outcasts, lepers, the blind, the sick, Gentiles, men and women, all people. And so this here, what Jesus is doing here in the temple, is kind of a culmination of his whole life's work, of who he had been to all people, accepting of all kinds to himself. And remember what happens on the cross when Jesus dies. The curtain in the temple is torn in two. Essentially, the curtain that separated people from God's Shekinah glory. That curtain is now ripped in two, and God's glory is now on the loose in the world. And so God's Spirit is available to all who accept him and believe in him and are obedient to him. So this was a word in many ways of judgment of what had become of God's people and the whole temple system. It has become one of exclusion rather than one of inclusion. But Jesus also says that this is to be a house of prayer. Now consider prayer for a minute. Prayer is not imposing our will on God, but opening ourselves to God's will. It's not an endeavor to get God to change his will, but an endeavor to release his will into our lives. And so prayer in many ways is like a boat hook that if you were standing on a boat, you would use to pull yourself into the dock or into the land. It's not the reverse. You're not trying to pull the dock to you or pull the whole earth to you. In the same way, prayer pulls us toward God. Prayer pulls us toward God, and that kind of action requires our compliance, requires our submission, letting God make us new. And Jesus shows us exactly how that works. He has been all the way along. In contrast to the systems within the temple and the religious leaders who are there, the religious leaders who defined the haves and the have-nots, defined who had salvation and who didn't. In contrast to this, Jesus submits to the will of the Father, just as we are to submit to the will of the Father as well. And so this word, this enacted sermon that Jesus gives here, is a judgment on the religious systems and also a message to potential Jesus followers that is only through humble submission that we receive him and what he has come to do. So as I close this afternoon, I want to just ask you to think about three different things, three questions. First of all, what does this story tell you about Jesus and what he has come to do? What does this tell you about it? Secondly, if Jesus is enacting his message of all-inclusive grace for all people, what tables need to be overturned in the modern church? What sort of systems and structures does the modern church have that we just need to remove? They're golden cows. They're things that have become idols for us, things that exclude people. What systems of inclusion have been propped up and that need to be thrown out? And then lastly, what is the shape of your heart? As we make our way toward Good Friday and Easter Sunday, what is the shape of your heart? Is it stone? Is it granite? Is it one that is hard that God has a very difficult time getting through? Or is it being broken by some really, really hard blows recently? Or is your heart shaped by the soft rain of the Spirit? Again, this episode and all of these episodes that we will walk through in the next couple of days are meant to really affect our spiritual posture so that when we finally do get to Good Friday and to Easter Sunday, we might know just how much we need the cross and the empty tomb. I hope you'll take a little bit of time to explore these scriptures, Mark chapter 11, Ezekiel 36, Isaiah 56. Just take some time to read through those and ask these questions of yourself. Thanks again for being a part of these opportunities with us, and I pray God's just immense blessings on your entire Holy Week. We'll see you next time.